I am very pleased to be able to hand over to Julia Long.
Really pleased to be doing this. It's something that we've talked about for quite a long time, and I think it's really needed. So I'm really grateful for WDI for creating this event. So my talk is titled The Problem of Femininity. Just to let you know the outline of the talk. I'm going to be thinking a bit about what is femininity. I'm going to be giving a feminist analysis, what maybe now we should call a radical feminist analysis, to be absolutely clear. Then I'm going to be thinking about some feminizing practices. Then I'm going to be raising a question of femininity as a fetish. And then thinking at the end about the whole issue of rejecting femininity and why, hopefully, by the time we get to that stage, you'll agree with me that we do want to reject femininity, and maybe why we see probably the overwhelming majority of women not rejecting femininity. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I think one of the reasons why so few women actually reject femininity is because I think the way that we see it and understand it is very different to the way that women who haven't developed a radical feminist analysis or had access to that, how they see it. It's because it's so absolutely prevalent and normalized and naturalized that that it's seen as something that is kind of inevitable. It's part of being a woman. For obviously, I'm talking in general terms. Some women absolutely do reject it, particularly young lesbians. But then, unfortunately, at the moment, what they're tending to do is to valorize masculinity and go down that path. But anyway, so just to be clear about what we think of as what we understand by this term femininity, I'm going to go back to some really sort of basic principles. So obviously, as with any radical feminist analysis, we start from an understanding of, if you want to call it patriarchy, of male-dominated society that has been in existence for several thousand years now. And that's our starting point, is understanding patriarchy as a system of male domination and female subordination. So if we think then about how this setup, this situation of domination and subordination is achieved, it's partly, we can look at it in different cultures and different aspects of our, we could call our culture as a number of different things. Some things that are very much enforced and violent, and then other things that that have a kind of a threat of force or violence behind them, but are seen as something that maybe we freely choose to do and that become a very naturalized part of society. And that, I would say, is where this these practices of both masculinity as a kind of all the different practices and behaviors that and what's seen as sort of natural attributes of men, how they work together to create masculinity, and then the inverse of that, all the what has been termed now, I see women using this term quite frequently on social media, ritualized subordination, all these different practices that achieve women's subordinate status. But I want to think about this term subordination because I think it's really important, because it reminds us that what we're talking about with this state of affairs is a political situation. It's about a political situation of dominance, of power imbalance. So subordination is the act of giving someone or something less importance or power. That's the Cambridge dictionary definition. Or the placement of that person or that thing in a lower class rank or position. So if we're saying that femininity is about subordination, this is what is part of what it's achieving. It's achieving the lowering of women as a class, putting us into the lower rank or position irrespective of men. So I think that's kind of a bit of a whistle stop analysis, but I hope that's kind of captured the essence of what femininity is. And so through what we can barely even really talk about gender now in the kind of what was the sort of more common feminist understanding of gender, sex roles, or sociological understanding, because one of the things I think that this whole transgenderist movement has done is to not only erase all the crucial words that we need for woman, or to try to erase those, but it's got everyone talking about this fictitious thing called gender identity. So now most of the time you see commentary in the media or social media about gender, it's talking about gender identity, whether it's affirming it or objecting to it or undermining it. But I think one of the things they've done is to really obscure the political understanding of gender. And I think what we're talking about through masculinity and femininity is the ways in which this relation of dominance and subordination is institutionalized, is naturalized, and certainly in terms of what we're going to be looking at now, it's eroticized. And I'm very grateful to Leah Keith for, I think, capturing the essence of what's going on with that sort of trio of, of what it does. So institutionalized in things like the institutions of heterosexuality, marriage. I'm sure I'll get loads of feedback now talking about heterosexuality as an institution, and as we might say, who wants to live in an institution? The family, certainly sort of legal institutions, those kinds of things. Naturalized, so women's subordination is naturalized through, scientific pseudo-scientific texts, I would say, things like evolutionary psychology, these kinds of things which suggest that femininity is inevitable. Also religious texts, which again suggest a kind of inevitability about, women's appropriate behavior. And then also obviously eroticized in all kinds of ways. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful ways which subordination is achieved. So I won't dwell on this side. It's just, again, really just to to think a bit more about this term subordination. If I had more time, I would talk about this very horrible image that I've selected, but I like using this image because it really shows what Andrea Dworkin is talking about when she talks about pornography as sexualized subordination. What she says is that subordination in any system of social subordination where you've got one group dominating another group, she says you've always got these four elements: hierarchy, objectification, submission, and violence. And I think this image, it basically is the visual representation of that, where we've got hierarchy, we've got the men very much on top of the woman, the woman's in this objectified and seemingly submissive position, and there's also the clear violence with the perpetrator or the predator's arm restraining her, and the threat of violence from the other men. So that's why I like to use that image, because I think it really shows the forces that that Dworkin is talking about. But I want to think about this word submission, because we might think, well, we don't submit to our subordination. We don't, we resist it in multiple ways, which is obviously true. I just included this because I think another very useful way to me of thinking about what femininity is I think femininity is codified submission, because the kinds of traits, behaviors, practices that are all, in their multiplicity, form part of femininity, are all kind of codifications of a submissive status. And I think that's really, really crucial. So, for example, in this really fantastic book by, I don't know, by Nancy Henley, which is actually 50 years old this year, or maybe next year actually. Henley talks about the different ways in which women and men are expected to use our bodies in relation to each other. So, there is some discussion of this, in recent years, things like women noticing man spreading, like that became a term, didn't it, that that's been sort of noticed and written about. But obviously, if we think about our whole environment, who gets to use space, actually, I must say, even sitting down and doing this, I usually like to just stand up and be talking. So I kind of feel quite restrained doing this. But, if we think about how it's seen as acceptable for women to sit, to hold ourselves, particularly in relation to others, particularly in relation to men, women's use of time compared to men's entitlement to time, all the different things about non-verbal communication, posture, gait, demeanor, who touch, who may feel entitled to touch. Again, perhaps less so now in recent years. We've got all these different cases. There was just one only just this week, wasn't there, of yet another male BBC TV presenter who's now finally, after many years, I think there's allegations of sexual misconduct. It seems like it's been going on a very long time. So all of these kinds of things, I think the way in which we're expected to participate in these things, it's all forms of codified submission, even to the extent of like who is entitled to give and maintain eye contact, facial expressions, a whole array of different kind of behaviors, which Henley talks about, I think, in very, very compelling ways, really making the point that these things are all political because they're about achieving dominance and submission. But what I'm going to talk about in particular now with the remaining slides are, I think, one of the most obvious, which is the beauty practices and physical appearance. I remember years ago when I did my teacher training qualification, long time ago, over 30 years ago, is it? Yeah, over 30 years ago now. Anyway, one thing's always stuck in my mind from what we were taught about classroom practice and classroom management. There were a really great series of lectures, and it was about communication and about setting the kind of emotional tone of the classroom and creating a purposeful environment. And one of the things that the lecturer said, and it's just always stayed with me because it just rang so true, he was talking about verbal communication and non-verbal communication. So obviously, one of the main things I'm doing now is verbal communication, and we pay a lot of attention to that. We pay a lot of attention to essays and analyses and the words that we use, and even things now like let women speak. It's very much the emphasis on our verbal communication. But I think we also need to be paying every bit as much attention to what we're communicating out, what we're communicating non-verbally, because people pick up messages from each other all the time through non-verbal communication. And if there's any, this is what we learn in the teacher training, if there's any if there's a lack of congruence, if there is a mismatch between verbal communication and non-verbal communication, we always believe the non-verbal over the verbal. So, for example, if Sheila said to me, are you coming for a drink after the seminar this afternoon? If I verbally said, yes, I'm coming for a drink, but my non-verbal communication was, oh yeah, I'm coming for a drink, she would see that actually I was totally unenthusiastic, even though my verbal communication. But as is definitely going to be the case, if she sees me say, oh yeah, like, of course I'm coming for a drink, there's a consistency there, but it's actually my non-verbal communication that she will believe. So if someone says, oh yeah, I suppose I'll go for a drink, and their non-verbal communication suggests the opposite, you're going to believe the non-verbal communication. So I think if we listen to all the different kind of arguments and I don't know, the interviews and things that are being said, if things that are being said is, oh, wearing lipstick doesn't make you a woman, but the woman who is saying that is wearing lipstick, I just raise this as a question that I find very, very resonant from what I learned all those years ago. People believe the non-verbal communication over what you're saying. This is why I think this is part of what is so powerful about all of these practices. Anyone who was at the Nordic Model Now conference knows I'm recycling this. I mean, partly because it is convenient to recycle my slides, but also because I just cannot get over this. It was something that I saw on a chat show, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago, something like that. Last sort of couple of years, I think. I happened to turn on the TV quite late in the evening, and I saw this image of a chat show. And if we look at it, we can see some very, very clear differences between the two male guests and the two female guests in the middle. So obviously, I suppose one of the most striking things is the sheer amount of body on display, the sheer amount of flesh on display. I mean, in the case of this, the woman sort of in the centre left, as I'm looking at it, who basically looks to be wearing underwear, barely covered underwear. And I just looked at it, and what is so striking to me, and actually the other woman, you know, looks more covered up, but then her legs are totally bare. So actually between them, if you have the legs of the second woman and the sort of the torso of the first woman, is basically you've got pretty much a naked woman or a woman just in her underwear. But what struck me as I was watching this, and if we look at the men, they're completely covered. Basically, you see their face, neck, and hands, and that's it. They're completely covered and wearing very neutral clothing. You know, this sort of black clothing. Well, the women are wearing quite black clothing as well, so you know there's a few splashes of colour. But I think clearly we can talk about all the things like the hair, the makeup, you know, all of these signifiers, which, as Sheila in her wonderful book, which if everyone hasn't already read it, I'm sure we're going to read it after this, Beauty and Misogyny, talks about this, you know, how one of the things that these beauty practices and fashion practices does is to suggest that women are different, like fundamentally different. It's this display of difference, but also the deference. It's a display of this kind of submissive status, this objectified status as well. But what really struck me when I was watching this chat show was the way I mean, I looked at it and I was quite taken aback because at the time I was a bit naive. I hadn't realised that it's become a whole thing now for women basically to go to all of these Oscar events or sports personality events or red carpet events, fashion catwalks, basically in a state of like real undress, like much more than I realized. And so I was quite shocked to see this. And I just felt very protective of this woman, that I just wanted to cover her up because that level of exposure, just to me, it's like, you know, when you have these nightmare dreams that I used again talk about teaching, that when I first started teaching, I'd wake up, you know, having these horrible dreams that I was in the class like naked. It's a fear of vulnerability or a fear of exposure, and then this is what is actually being acted out. But what I couldn't get over was the way that everyone just carried on as though this was completely normal. Everyone carried on having all their chats and telling their anecdotes as this was completely normal. And this is the painting that I was reminded of. I just thought, like, when you see this painting, maybe because it's a painting, maybe because it's like you know, a couple of centuries ago, whenever it was, to me this is such an obvious depiction of prostitution. It's like, it's so obvious. But in fact, in terms of that setup, it's really not a million miles from what we're seeing now, completely normalized. And then this is part of the same photo shoot that the woman who was in that chat show did. And again, I think this representation of as women, as prostituted women, I think it becomes, you know, thoroughly kind of unequivocal here, you know, where she's reclining on the bed, etc., etc. So, but this is completely normalized. And yes, some other images here of this state of really very normalized state of like near nakedness, which seems to just be passing pretty much without commentary. We don't really see the men unless it's some man pretending to be a woman, or I don't know, some man who thinks he's non-binary, or you know, whatever it is. We don't tend to see the men in this kind of get-up. You know, we see the men in their suits and ties, and you know. But how must it feel to be a woman? I just, in that scenario, I just can't even imagine that level of being exposed amongst all of these men. It's yeah, I just can't even imagine. And of course then this image is sold to the rest of us. What strikes me, and I think this is why I do feel very often, and particularly in recent weeks on social media, why I do feel very alienated from what is undoubtedly some kind of resurgent women's movement of a kind, I think. the fact that a lot of women have become very mobilized around transgenderism and, you know, fighting for just basically for the word woman and the word mother and all of these kinds of things, and getting men out of our spaces and the harms being done to children. But I think one of the reasons that I do feel quite alienated is that we really, apart from within, certainly there are elements such as WDI and other groups, and of course we've got all the fantastic, like the South Korean 4B movement, and this is taken off in America, as I understand, to some extent. But what we've got is a really acute awareness now, I think, of the harms of. So I've got here on the left hand side of these terrible instruments of torture like breast binders. But at the same time, even before this whole gender identity and transgenderism became this phenomenon that it is now, obviously there was a whole women's liberation movement that was throwing off, you know, this kind of thing, which is, you know, I remember, I'm old enough to remember, not that I was only little at the time, the things like the 18-hour girdle and the play text, but, you know, all of these kinds of things is, even corsets, I do remember actually with my grandmother. But now we've got the shapewear, the spandex, you know, these kinds of things. We've got these terrible instruments of torture, and that image on the right-hand side, this was a feature on our local news about children, like young girls, really young, like primary school age girls, because of social media now being obviously not all of them, but definitely it's a thing, being very preoccupied with anti-aging creams. And this is a fridge where she keeps her anti-aging cream in this little pink fridge. So this is all going on. And before, as I say, before transgenderism, there was all of this, like, let girls be girls and let toys be toys. There was, you know, all of that. And there isn't too much of that now. Just to finish then, probably we are aware, I think most of us will recognise these two individuals from the whole issue of transgenderism. So we've got Jazz Jennings here, the boy who was castrated very young and has got his own TV show and is now going through all kinds of terrible issues, from what I can gather. And on the other side, we've got Ellen Page, who now calls herself Elliot Page. So I think most of us who kind of keep abreast of these things, we're aware of who they are. But I just wonder how many of us know who any of these women are on the next slide. I would imagine probably none. I mean, admittedly, these others have got, the ones I mentioned before, have got gained some kind of celebrity status through having TV shows or being in films. But just to put these women into the picture, the three women, the two women in the centre and the woman on the left, it's Leah Cambridge, Claudia Ederotimi, and Alice Webb, who all died as a result of the so-called Brazilian butt lift procedure. Two of them abroad, and Alice Webb in the bottom there, centre. She only died very recently, tragically, horrifically, in this country. She was the first woman to die from that procedure in this country. But I just think it's quite telling, isn't it? That, you know, we could all be making more of a noise about it. I could be making more of a noise, which is why I'm very glad that we've got this opportunity now. And the two women on the right there, Jan Spivey, I think her name is, and Athele, sorry, Jones, I think her name is. These two women are survivors of the terrible PIP breast implant scandal. You know, when the women years ago now, like 10, 15 years ago, were injected with silicone grade, industrial grade silicone, and have got clumps of toxic silicone now floating around their bodies. So I'm going to have to finish there. Sorry if I went a little bit over time. And then maybe the ideas about femininity as fetish and some of those other things about rejecting femininity we can talk about in the discussion.
Following on from what Julia has said, I think a central point is that gender is less like this picture at the top of everybody, lots of people choosing what their gender is, what their gender identity through choice, and it's more like the one below. It's a male oppressing a female. Now, the problem that we have when we're fighting gender identity ideology is that we radical feminists see gender and femininity as imposed often by force. So we would say that the situation is the bottom picture. It's a form of oppression. But the problem with women on our side who are fighting gender identity ideology, choosing femininity and saying, it's just my choice. I just happen to like wearing dresses, or I love lipstick, or it makes me feel good. The problem with that is that they are agreeing with the top. They're saying gender is like this. It's just my choice. Now, or there are two things that it could be. They're either saying it's a choice, or they're saying it is an expression of my innate feminine essence or my true essence. And they're fundamentally different things. It makes it very, very difficult to fight gender if you are choosing it, if you're saying it's a choice or it's your individual identity. The next slide that we're going to get up is showing the gender spectrum, the G.I. Joe gender spectrum, where the epitome of maleness and masculinity is a soldier. And the epitome of femininity is a Barbie. And this is actually the core roles for males and females under patriarchy. A male with his weapon, and he's not wearing that combat gear to fight an outside enemy. He's wearing it to fight us, females. Now, we're gaslit into believing, oh, G.I. Joe, these great males who fight the enemy, the other nation. It's not. This man is fighting us. He is oppressing us. He's wearing his masculinity to oppress us. So these are the masters in patriarchy, and we are wearing, well, if we wear femininity, we're wearing the symbols of our own oppression, which is not a good idea. So here we've got some female news anchors. This is just what Julia's just been showing. But these femininity signifies consent to the relationship of subordination. And as women are getting more powerful and getting into more situations like being news anchors, this woman on the right is a football commentator. They are performing more femininity because they're showing their submission. They're saying, thanks for the job in patriarchy, but I agree, I'm submissive. On the left-hand side, we've got of this Venn diagram, we've got gender abolitionists. That's us. We want to abolish gender. So we want sex. We want there to just be sex. Now, in the middle, there are conservatives who want sex and gender. So they want to recognize sex is real, and they want sex role stereotypes, feminine women, masculine men. And on the right-hand side, there are, I'm calling them gender identarians, but people who believe in gender identity. They want gender and basically to abolish sex. In the middle, we've got male and female, with males being masculine and females being feminine. That's the conservatives. And on the right-hand side, the gender identarians, masculine and feminine people with no sex. They want to abolish sex. We know that. A picture shows 1,000 words. Now, we've got 4 pictures here, and we can already put some of these pictures into the Venn diagram. The male and female who are not wearing gender stereotypical clothes, you could say they fit in the sex area because they're not performing femininity or masculinity. The male and female, with males being masculine and females being feminine, fit in with the conservatives. So the picture is saying this is where I fit. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a couple of drag queens who are feminine identified people, and we're told there's no need to know your sex. This is one of the reasons why the whole thing is problematic, is we've got some gender non-conforming, let's assume these are gender non-conforming females. Now, where are they going to go in the Venn diagram? Are they going to go into the gender identarians, or are they going to go along with the gender abolitionists? So we've got a question for these people. Do they want to go to the gender abolitionists, like in the 70s and 80s that Julia was saying, and we've talked about, that was the project of radical feminists, that we want to abolish gender. So young women who don't want to perform sex role stereotypes could come with the gender abolitionists. Or they decide they're going to go to the gender identitarians, the trans rights ideology, where they just say we're gendered, agendered, and they are attracted to that. Here, we've got the same thing again. Now, you can see from this picture, we've got the woman in a Barbie dress is going to be sex and gender. She is a conservative. So she's saying a picture shows 1,000 words. The woman in the right-hand side is gender abolitionist. She is a female who knows she's a female and wants to abolish gender. So she's not wearing gendered stereotypes. And then the person in the middle is showing in the way that they're dressed that they are a gender, they believe in gender. And one of the ways is the pink hair, lots of makeup. So they're performing femininity, but quite likely being male. So there we can see where they are. It could be that if you're a young woman and you don't like sex role stereotypes, you would think, good, and you'd look at the Venn diagram that I've just shown and you'd think, oh yes, I'm going to go with the gender abolitionists. But the problem is that the mainstream media, both left and right, pretty much everybody, doesn't show the Venn diagram, truly. What they show is they show there is just conservative sex and gender, where people believe in sex and they believe in femininity and masculinity, or gender. So you can see in this Venn diagram the real options which are really presented to people, to young women, or I suppose young men, are you either go with the conservative sex and gender, or you go with the queer movement, gender identitarians who want just gender, abolish sex. So it's like what's happened is that the transgender movement has taken, they've taken over, they're the people who are selling the option to not have sex and gender. And they're saying the only way to do that is to just have gender. Whereas we used to say, you can abolish gender. And that's why, and you can see in this one, but you can barely see that there is this option. People can barely see radical feminists. They can barely see our message. They don't know it's there. And that's one big reason why we need to not perform femininity. Because if we perform femininity, a picture shows 1,000 words, young women will look at us and say they must be Tory, they must be conservative. And I think that's one reason why everybody thinks that if you're against gender, the whole queer thing, you must be a conservative. It's because they can't see, you can barely see that there's this other option, which is abolish gender. It's so silenced. Okay, so that's one reason why we need to do it, is we need to be out there, we need to be seen, we need to say, this is an option, you can do this. And the more of us who do it, the more likely it is it becomes an option. And I mean, it's really, really worrying. And it's also very confusing to people who see us talking against gender but performing femininity, because they're looking at the pictures. This is an example of a woman who, on the left-hand side, is when she was gender non-conforming, thinking she was trans, and then here we are, she's detransitioned. Now, what we would like her to do when she detransitions, or not even do it, is to have you can be gender non-conforming. You don't have to go out of the frying pan into the fire. You don't have to go back to the Tory, the conservative sex and gender thing. It's almost as over and over again, there are detransitioners who think the way I'm going to show that I'm a woman is by performing femininity. And what we want to say is, no, you don't. You can abolish it. You don't have to perform femininity. Okay, this is a second reason why we can't win this if we perform femininity. So this is from Carol Pateman's The Sex sexual contract, which is brilliant. Now, I'm going to read from the middle bit of it. It says, slave masters took pains to ensure that their slaves were marked as powerless through a variety of means, including naming, clothing, hairstyles, language, and body marks, and the use of the emblematic master's instrument, the whip. Moses Finley recounts a fictitious tale from Herodotus about the manner in which Scythians regained their mastery over their slaves in revolt. So long as they see us in arms, they think themselves our equals and of equal birth. But once they see us with whips instead of arms, they will understand that they are our slaves. Centuries later, Nietzsche has the little old woman say to Zarathustra, "You are going to woman, do not forget your whip." Now, what I would say is femininity is the whip and masculinity is the whip. Both femininity and masculinity are the whip, and we are whipping ourselves. And every time a man says to a woman, "You're not looking very feminine, darling, wear a dress," or "I'd like it if you wore a bit more lipstick," that is the telling us that we are their slaves. And every time we say yes, we're saying, yes, we are your slaves, and that's why we don't have to do it. So it's basically, we're living in the, people say, oh, why can't we get rid of patriarchy? It's because we can't see the whip that is keeping us there, and we're doing it to ourselves. So we need to stop doing it. And it's like, look, no hands patriarchy. Patriarchy has got inside our heads so much, or so many women doing self-flagellation. Not only do females do it to themselves, but drag queens are promoting femininity because patriarchy knows it's the whip. They know, I mean, there are lots of other reasons for it, but in one way, one explanation is it works very well for the male sex class to have power over women, to celebrate the drag queens. And interestingly, this guy here, he goes, celebrity drag star says drag queens are the Marines of the queer movement. And that comes back very nicely to, they have the GI Joes who threaten violence to us. And then they have these Marines who are, they're just glorifying femininity because it's the whip. They're just saying, look, the subjugation you're under. We want to accept or understand that femininity is unhelpful. It's a form of oppression. It's a method of oppression, and we can break out from it. It's a celebration and a glorification of the patriarchy. And when women perform femininity, what they're doing is they're showing that they are worthy of respect in a patriarchal society. So I'm joking on the worthy of respect in a democratic society, the Forstater ruling, but femininity is showing you're worthy of respect because you're basically saying, I've bought into this, I'm doing the deal, I'm playing along, I'm not too bad. And what I think is, we can't get rid of gender if we perform gender, and we don't want to be worthy of respect in a patriarchal society. We want to overthrow patriarchy. And I just fundamentally believe we're not likely to overthrow it if we're performing it. And if we think it's a choice. This isn't that good, but it's, women are rejecting femininity. We're not TERFs, we're WAFs. And women of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your heels.
This present stage of, or kind of feminism, which is supposedly fighting the problem of transgenderism, which is that many of these women, very prominent women, in this new movement, if we want to call it a movement, do femininity and then some in a very, very serious way, with the bleached hair and makeup and lipstick and extremely feminine clothing, in a way which would have been imaginable at one time. I just think of one instance back in about 1983 in Women Against Violence Against Women in London. We had meetings with about 40 women at a time, almost all lesbians, and some were just in the stage of becoming a lesbian, but they'd be a lesbian tomorrow. That's basically how it was. And at one of these meetings, we had someone from Women Against Violence, from Women Against Pornography New York come and address us. We were very excited to see her, and she arrived and she was wearing an above the knee skirt and lipstick and long hair. We all had short hair, trousers. We wouldn't have dreamt of having any kind of makeup at all. And we were just astonished. There was complete silence in the room. We all just sat there, you know, pinned to the spot with horror, because we could not believe that there were, in America there clearly were, feminists and prominent feminists who did femininity. In Britain, that was not the case. There were none. There really, really, really were not any. Feminists in Britain didn't do makeup. We didn't do any of that shit. We just really, really, really didn't. So seeing it was totally shocking. Now that is so normalized that if you try to actually talk about how all of these practices are a problem, which was completely accepted really by feminists in the 80s, you get in some trouble. So one of the questions that I thought I'd like to ask the two of you is, when you try to talk about these things, what are the sort of responses you get from other women?
I suppose, Sheila, if I could put that into sort of two parts, I'm just thinking back. Well, I suppose thinking to conversations I've had with women who are much younger than myself, when I was teaching in particular, I do remember having, after the seminar had finished, I was having a chat with these students who probably would have been about 19, 20. And we had a really good conversation, and they were telling me about all the kind of leg shaving and waxing, and now, you know, the getting rid of all your pubic hair, you know, all these kinds of things. And so I really sympathise. I remember what it was like being at school. I really sympathise with the pressure on young women to conform, you know, and do all this stuff. Because I did ask them, like, what do you think would happen if you didn't do it? And I just can see her now. One of these young women said to me, "You'd be a social outcast." So I think, you know, this is part of like what is so powerful about the force of it, is that if you're not doing all that, obviously you could then decide, oh, I'm transgender, and then you get all the kudos for being that, but at terrible, terrible cost to everything about your life. But the risk, if they don't do that, is ostracized, not being part of a group, because there's so much culture around it as well, and being part of heterosexuality and all the rest of it. So I do have a huge amount of sympathy for young women, which I think is all the more reason why we need to be rejecting it, visibly rejecting it. But I see that really very differently to women who are very prominent or active now in this sort of wider, you know, this kind of gender critical, if you want to call it that. And if basically, I think there's certain norms now that have just become acceptable. There are certain, talk about compelled speech. There's a lot of compelled speech within gender critical things, of what you can say and what you can't say. As soon as you start to suggest that other options may be available beyond, you know, living with men or beyond doing femininity, I've met with a lot of defensiveness, and in particular women really feeling attacked by it. I'd say it's just this feeling of attack, which I think is really interesting, because like look, we're in this little WDI webinar in this little room here. I don't know how many women might be watching or will watch on YouTube. Like, what are we compared to the beauty industry, compared to all the social media? That, so are those women who are objecting to me raising an objection, or yourself raising an objection, feeling attacked? Do they not feel attacked by, I don't even know what the makeup companies are these days, like Estee Lauder, something really old one, Rimmel. Like, do they not feel attacked by this endless propaganda that they're subjected to all the time, or every time they walk past a bloody nail bar or something? Clearly not. So I think it's one of those good old Mary Daly reversals, where they see us as pointing out what is wrong with it all. They seem to take that as a personal attack, but I do think it does show the absolute kind of psychological and emotional investment in it. And that's been my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people take it as an attack, but some people listen and then they change. So I've seen quite a lot of people who haven't thought about it, and then they think about it, and then they change. And so I think it's true. Definitely, people will take it as an attack, but because there is a very, very powerful logic in our arguments. I think it's worth it explaining the arguments, and I also don't feel it's individual women's fault that they've never come across the argument. It might be the first time they've come across the argument.
Of course.
So I think that it is possible to articulate the argument and then leave it hanging. I definitely think people are they don't like the idea, they hate the idea that they think it's a choice and they're doing it for themselves, and that we're saying, no, it's not. It's you're being oppressed. They hate that. But unfortunately, I think that's true, and we just need to keep saying it.
Can I just say as well, yeah, because I totally agree with what you're saying as well, Joan. It kind of modifies a bit. I think there tends to be quite a difference between some of the reaction I've had from some of, the sort of spokeswomen, who may be more invested than a lot of the other women, because obviously there's a lot of, on social media, there's a lot of anonymous accounts, and that. So I think probably what we're saying is an analysis that they certainly can recognise and see the validity of it. So yeah, maybe I was a bit too hasty, but I suppose as well the reactions I remember are where you get like a bit quite a lot of kickback. That's what I remember. And also I think if we think about the women who speak at all these different events and go along to things, a lot of those women, I don't know, they don't really excessively, like most women are wearing fairly sensible clothing, and I don't know how true it is, but I think there's obviously like prominent women across the board who are doing all of that stuff, and they seem to be the faces that get caught on the media, that kind of thing. But I don't know, what do you
The puzzle is, these are all women we're talking about who are involved in a campaign to stop men doing feminine gender. If they believe in gender, as is clear from their person, they absolutely do, and they represent it on their persons most fiercely, then what they're saying is those men can't have femininity. We want it. It belongs naturally to us. And that's a very, very strange argument, which I don't think is going to get us anywhere. And of course, the radical feminist argument is gender is the problem. We need to get rid of the whole thing. So I slightly disagree, Jo, because I think that, with both of you, and saying, yes, you understand why women do it. I absolutely understand why women who've never heard the argument just persist with this. But some of the most prominent names are basically saying, we don't want men to have our femininity. That's what they're saying. We want it. My lipstick, not yours. And that's very strange.
Yeah, and it's a fundamental problem with the argument, and it makes our argument very, very weak if we say that, because inevitably it makes us look conservative. It fits us into the bit of the Venn diagram. If we say we want to keep our femininity for ourselves, not for those men, it ends up being we want sex and gender. We want to keep gender because we're doing femininity, and we want sex to be understood. So you're right there in the conservative bit. Mm-hmm. So it's a massive, massive problem. And because a picture shows 1,000 words, it's whatever you say, people can see that you're doing gender. Mm-hmm. But on the positive side, what about the 4B movement in Korea, where they read your book, Sheila, Beauty and Misogyny, and thousands or even hundreds of thousands of women took off the corset and stopped wearing makeup, stopped shaving, stopped doing beauty practices. Now that shows that you can make an argument, and it is possible for people to hear it. And that's what I think we should be doing. We should be giving that book out because people can read it. That is a book that is, it's a way, we've seen that it works as a method. I've given it to young women who've read it, and it's changed the way they dress. So I think that does work. and maybe there are some, and maybe there are some people who are open to listening, and some who are not. But so I don't. We mustn't give up hope.
Except that that book was published in English, and in places like Australia and Britain, where English is spoken, there is not a sign, not a single tiny shoot at all, showing that there is any criticism of gender and femininity developing. It's developing in places where my book is published, which is Japan and China, on the other side of the world, but it's been here for a very long time, and there is absolutely no developing critique. So I don't share your hope about that, though I'm thrilled about what's happening in Japan and Korea in other countries. But here, the commitment to total vicious femininity seems to be pretty much complete.
Yeah.
There were the beginnings of rejection of the like the beauty practices and all that goes along with it. I suppose I'm thinking of that era of doing all the radical feminist conferences about sort of 10 years or so ago. Again, much smaller numbers than the women who are involved now. But I think, at those things, we did put those kind of, I don't remember exact sessions that we had, but we were talking about that kind of thing, or women were just with other, again, because non-verbal communication is so powerful, just by literally being in the room, just by being in the room really with other women who aren't doing all of that, it's kind of, you start to just almost by osmosis. I think actually a lot of this, you keep using the term argument, Joe, but something that I think is every bit as important, if not even more so, is literally just the creation of new norms and osmosis. Because I think the idea of argument is it's based on this sort of like rational actor idea that I'm going to read this book and I can see the salience of the argument is very cogent, I agree with it, so therefore I'm going to be a rational actor and I'm going to rationally change my behaviour. But then we see, as Sheila said, that book has been available now in English-speaking countries for what, 20 years? Or when did it come out? 20 years ago. And actually women aren't doing that. So we don't always act on the level of rational argument, but I think it's much more to do with all the creation of the women-only space, because I think for especially what I do really remember for those young women, it's so much bound up with heterosexuality and basically a fear of not being loved, not being rejected from your group, not being loved. Like it goes hand in hand with the whole ideology of romance and finding a man and I don't know, probably still marrying and having children, or all of that, as opposed to being this lonely spinster, which seriously, for us that is a symbol of complete freedom than being a lonely spinster, a so-called lonely spinster. So I think unless there's a shift, like one woman on her own reading that book, even if she shares it with a friend, it might not go anywhere, because if all her friends are doing all this other stuff, and she feels she hasn't got any, peer group or whatever, to get all the things that we need, like the companionship. Young women get so much social approval from doing all of this. Male dominance, female subordination is institutionalized, naturalized.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I'm creating for you, Sheila. You were talking about Joe and Julia about when you bring up notions of femininity and women defending that. And my observation is that I've observed a kind of a weird culture in women from 40 and under, I think it is, where anything that you say that's even vaguely critical about something they do is immediately taken as a criticism about the person. And that there seems to be really a lot of that there's not this ability to problematize or to take to be a bit like objective and have a discussion around a point of disagreement, for instance. And that, I think, makes it really difficult to engage from an older feminist perspective with what a lot of young women understand to be a feminist perspective, which is always about, well, I do it and I'm a feminist, therefore having my hair down to my ass is So, yeah, and there's just this. There seems to be an inability to have a critical conversation, which I think in a lot of what you've written is essential to be able to look at these points.
I just remember a few years ago, I was collecting all these articles that they were, maybe they've stopped now, but there was a bit of a fad for all these really crappy opinion pieces in the Guardian or these kind of papers to do all these really fluff pieces, things like, can you be a feminist and have a boob job? Can you be a feminist and wear high heels? Can you be? And they basically mentioned every single thing that we've been talking about. But the answer was always yes. So always yes. And in fact, I had just at the end of my presentation, we didn't have time to get onto it. There's a thing that I just picked up off social media. Someone, I don't even know who put it on there. But it was this little meme thing that someone had done saying, you can do all these things and be a feminist, and then it listed, oh god, I don't know, I would probably be quite crude, well, BDSM, I remember was one of them, BDSM, wear high heels, I don't even know, like give blowjobs or whatever. It was all of these things. You can do all of these things, and can you be a feminist? Yes. And then it says, but you can't be a feminist if you shame anyone for doing any of that. So it completely reverses. I think this whole thing of shaming, like that, even that stupid expression, it never used to exist, did it? All this kink shaming and body shaming and slut shaming, all of that. But this whole idea that's kind of now takes the place of an argument, doesn't it, or an analysis? Because straight away, but you're lucky if you've only come across it in women under 40 because it's on a higher age range. Yeah.
No, so response. It's not a question, just in response.
Yes. So Elaine and then Lynn.
Yeah.
Nice and loud so everyone can hear.
Okay. I think the thing about arguing has gone, but I remember in the heyday of radical feminism, it was fine to say, "Why aren't you a lesbian?" It was more than just wearing makeup and all that. And we challenge women. We don't understand why you say you're a radical feminist if you sleep with a man, and that was, you probably remember that. That was quite acceptable. So I think it's interesting. We need to analyse why things have gone so backwards, even in terms of talking about things. That's all I want to put.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Well, Lynn and then Sheila.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think there are a lot of young women who reject femininity. A lot of teenage girls, for example, and I've got two granddaughters. Who are not only one of them is a teenager now, but I think there are a lot of girls and teenagers who are actually rejecting the idea of compulsory femininity, and it comes up in certain. It does come up in certain areas where it becomes really problematic. For example, in terms of women and sports, because they are so sexualized in often women who are in sports that and they've been so targeted by propaganda of you must be sexualized to participate in this sport or that sport, that is a real problem. But there are I think there are quite a few teenagers and even older ones in their early 20s who do reject things like they reject they reject conforming to men, and they might not be lesbians, but they reject being subjected to the patriarchy, if you like, in lots of circumstances. So I don't think it's as bad as we thought it was. And in terms of your book, Sheila, I think when you give young women that book, then it does really have I think you said this before, Joe, that it does really have an impact on them when they read this sort of about the misogyny of makeup and wearing high heels and all of that as well, and being subjected to all those awful feminine
beauty practices.
beauty practices, but also being subjected to being objectified, because that's what it can come down to, that a lot of young women can feel that they're just being objectified in terms of standing up against it, if you like.
Yeah. Let's go to Sheila, because so I'll bring the mic back over to you. Yeah.
All to say really was that I thought that the point that Elaine was making just then was a very good one, which is back in the day, it was possible to say things like, why on earth don't you become a lesbian, for instance? And that was said to me, I think it was about 75, 76. I was in Amsterdam. I remember where it was. I was in this joint sort of accommodation I was living in with a friend and some others. And she said that to me. And she said, because I was heterosexual at the time, that actually if you're involved with men, you're giving your energies to those who are actually the enemy, the problem, instead of those who are on the same side. And if you're a feminist and you want to create a revolution, obviously you want a bit of a tight circle here. You want all your energies, especially your most loving and most important ones, and your ones, all of those of friendship as well as political ones, who are those you are fighting the struggle with. For a very simple point. And I went back to London and told the two men living in my flat to leave. Now, I didn't say I feel chastised. You are a nasty person. You are making me feel uncomfortable. To me, I was involved in a political struggle, and these are the sort of things we say to each other. But we have somehow reached the point where making ordinary political argument, not ordinary actually, revolutionary political argument, is now seen as a kind of hurt to other women. Makes you a nasty person. You should not do it. I'm sorry, folks, but we're not going to have any kind of revolution at all, and I still want one. We a situation where we're not actually allowed to tell political truths to other women.
I just literally had a version of that myself from a prominent member of the LGBT Alliance chastising me for being homophobic. I hadn't even mentioned the word lesbian. It was just where I'd said recently, and I've put it in the most like really mild and expansive terms that I said a few weeks ago, living with men, and because I wasn't even particularly specifically talking about being lesbian. I was saying just generally living with men, marrying men is not inevitable. Other options are available. And of course, I had the hounds of hell unleashed on me for that. So because of that reaction, I just put a little funny thing up saying shopping for meat, cooking meat and eating meat is not inevitable, or other options are available. And then it all kicked off again. And then someone from the LGBT Alliance came, who I have no engagement with whatsoever and never interact with her apart from the last time she actually did chastise me, so she makes a habit of it. She came up and did chastise me for my supposed homophobia in equating eating meat with lesbianism, because eating meat is a choice, and if you suggest lesbianism is a choice, it's homophobic. So there we go. And that's when I hadn't even mentioned the word. Well, it doesn't really even matter who it is, but it's someone prominent.
Yes, everybody's very, very scared and being terribly, terribly good these days, and we mustn't have serious political discussion. I'm not going to obey the rule. Indeed, we're not obeying the rule today.
I think it's okay to have this position that we should reject femininity, but because it's a useful thing to do, because it can help the revolution, it can help us beat transgender ideology. But I don't think it means that somebody who, let's say, wears lipstick is not doing a fantastic job in the struggle and doing lots of good things. It just is a sort of, well, in my mind, we're saying we could do even better if we rejected femininity. But it doesn't mean everything that people do, if they're doing femininity, is bad. Because there's a lot of people in the chat saying, well, I've got long hair. Does that mean I'm invalid? And it doesn't. We're all doing good things. And I suppose this is one argument saying some of us think you could do even better things. We could do even better things. And I suppose that's it. But it's not invalidating lots of the good things lots of women are doing. Okay, Sheila.
I would like to say that what I would say is that everybody is on, and I know this sounds a bit nicey, but at different stages on your journey. And I do think that in the end, women should and probably will all become lesbians. I've always thought that, which is why I call those women who are not yet lesbians pre-lesbians. And that's what we did in the 1970s. We called women not yet lesbians pre-lesbians, because we didn't want to use the word heterosexual. And we were basically saying next week, next month, and so on, right? I do think the same thing about all of the beauty practices. I absolutely love and respect all my sisters who are doing all of those things, but I believe we're all on the same journey, and the end point of the journey is the ending of our oppression, the ending of our slavery, and that means everybody, all the women I love, are going to get rid of these practices, and I think they'll become lesbians too.
Brilliant. Brilliant way to end. So I'm going to end the webinar. I don't think we could beat that. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. See you next week.